Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I just finished reading Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, and I wanted to talk about it. So let's get into it. So some background on this. This is the third novel published by Jane Austen in her lifetime, after Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. It was published in 1814. What I thought was really interesting about it, though, is that this is the first novel that she wrote after she had become an established author. So both Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice were revised basically from drafts of novels she had written much earlier, like 15 years earlier, and then published in 1811 and 1813 respectively. But this, Mansfield Park, she actually didn't start writing until 1811. So after Sense and Sensibility was published, or around when it was like going into publication maybe. She was 36 years old at that point. And Mansfield Park it wasn't finished until 1813. So at that point, like, Jane Austen was already known for Sense and Sensibility and for Pride and Prejudice. And Mansfield Park didn't actually end up getting published until 1814. Well, I guess the other thing that I should say too is that this is my third Austen book that I've read. After I've read Sense and Sensibility and I read Pride and Prejudice, and now I'm reading this. So I'm just going to stick with reading them in their publication order, basically, since that's how I've kind of already started it. So anyway, going into this, I kind of assumed that Mansfield Park would be a little bit of a more mature work than Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, just because she's so much older as she's writing it, and because she has all this experience of being an author already. And I think that it kind of holds up to that assumption, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. So Mansfield Park follows Fanny Price, who is the daughter of kind of they're not working class, they're like a lower professional class family. Her father is like a low-ranking member of the Navy who, it's kind of like clear he's a failure. Like in the end notes of this Oxford World Classics edition, it talks about how like it's expected that someone with his rank would have been promoted after like a year, and he's been at that same rank for like 7 years, so he's like a failure. So the Price family has a ton of kids. I think they have 8 kids. They can't afford all of these kids, and so her mother, Mrs. Price, writes to her sister, Lady Bertram, and says, like, I have all of these kids and I can't take care of all of them. Can you take one of them? And Lady Bertram says, sure, Fanny can come live at Mansfield Park with me and Sir Thomas Bertram. So Sir Thomas Bertram is a baronet, which is like in the lower aristocracy. So they're much better off than the Price family. So Fanny moves in with the Bertrams. It's kind of like a Cinderella story. Like she's neglected and abused by her other aunt, who also lives there, Mrs. Norris. And so she's living there, you know, with her aristocratic aunt and her kind of like spoiled daughters who are mean to her, and Fanny is kind of just like abused and neglected by this family. And then some new people move into the area, into Mansfield Park, into the parsonage there, and they're like younger people, single, and you know, like everyone. So the Bertrams have 2 other daughters. They're a little bit older than Fanny. Fanny's the youngest of them, but they're all of eligible age, right? And so these new young people, and the Bertrams also have 2 sons as well, also of eligible age. And so there's these 2 new young people in the neighborhood, and like they all start to mingle and you know, flirt and do the Jane Austen-y things. So that's kind of what the story is about. I will say the plot is, it's much less of a plot-driven book, I think, than like Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is like very fast, like things happen really quickly. Mansfield Park is a bit more of a slow burn. Like Pride and Prejudice and like Sense and Sensibility, one of the biggest themes in Mansfield Park is about marriage. Like the thing that this book is concerned about, or one of the things, is marriage, and about the economic necessity of getting married to young women in this time period in early 19th century Britain. Like you need to get married to survive, basically. You need to get money. So like you can't earn money yourself, really. You need to get married so that you can survive. but there's also this tension of like, do you just marry whoever comes in, or like, how does love play into this, and what is love, kind of, too? I think that's an important question in Jane Austen. So yeah, it rehashes that same theme that Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility both touch on. I think it does do it in a more mature and a more sort of complex way than either of those two novels did, for a couple of reasons. One is the introduction of the Bertram sisters, they're in a much different situation than either the Bennets or the Dashwoods. They're not going to be, like, the Dashwoods in Sense and Sensibility are basically in a very, very precarious situation at the start of the novel. Like, they will not have a place to live soon. And the Bennets are kind of they're not in as precarious of a situation. Like, Mr. Bennet does well enough in his business, and like he can provide for his daughters, but really, like, Lizzie needs to get married at some point soon for economic reasons. The Bertram sisters, Julia and Maria, don't really need to get married as urgently for economic reasons, but they do need to get married. They do still want to get married very quickly for independence. And that in itself is kind of like an interesting thing, because they're not really going to be independent when they're married. They're going to be dependent upon their husband. But what it does grant them is independence from Sir Thomas Bertram and from Mansfield Park. And that's the thing that both of them are very interested in. So yeah, that's an angle that you don't see so much in Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility on this same theme. The other reason that I think that Mansfield Park handles this theme a little more complexly, the way that Fanny rejects Henry Crawford's proposal. It's really similar to Pride and Prejudice. So Darcy in Pride and Prejudice proposes to Lizzie, and Lizzie immediately rejects him. Over time, Lizzie kind of like teaches Darcy how to be good and how to like love her the way that she wants to be loved. And then they end up like getting together. He reforms himself, and then they get married. In Mansfield Park, Henry Crawford proposes to Fanny, and Fanny rejects him unequivocally. She does not want to marry Henry Crawford. So that parallels the Darcy thing, but it's very easy in Pride and Prejudice to side with Lizzie, because even during his proposal, Mr. Darcy is so rude to her, and he's very unkind and rude and oblivious. And so you can sympathize with, like, yeah, no, don't marry this jerk. But in Mansfield Park, like, Henry Crawford, the reformation that Darcy will do after the proposal, he's already done at this point. He's done some really significantly, like, kind things for Fanny at this point. And also, Fanny is in a much more economically precarious situation than Lizzie was. Like, Fanny, she's not an orphan, but she's almost equivalent to an orphan. Like, she has no right to the Bertram estate, because she's not a legitimate child of the Bertrams. She's a child of the Prices. And the Prices have nothing. They have nothing that they can give her. She really does, unless she wants to just be Lady Bertram's, like, woman-in-waiting for the rest of her life, she needs to get married. And she never leaves Mansfield Park. There aren't any other young people here. It's not like there are going to be any other options aside from Henry. And like I said, Henry at this point, he kind of seems like he's turned around and he's a nice guy now. Like, he helped her brother out. He's done some very, very nice, good things. And he's also, like, he's treating her with a lot more respect now. He's deferential to her. He's just being very, very nice to her. And all of the other characters in the book are like, why are you rejecting him? Like, you're insane. This guy is perfect, and he's rich, and you are this really poor girl. You have no other prospects. You are insane to be rejecting this guy. And as a reader, like, you kind of agree with them. You kind of have to agree with them that Fanny is making a really bad decision here. But at the same time, like, in doing that, Austen is giving her kind of like an even more powerful agency than she's given any of the Dashwoods or the Miss Bennets. There's a really interesting quote that I'm going to read. This is on page 277 of the Oxford World Classics edition. Fanny says, "I should have thought," said Fanny to Edmund, "that every woman must have felt the possibility of a man's not being approved, not being loved by some one of her sex at least, let him be ever so agreeable. Let him have all the perfections in the world, I think it ought not to be set down as certain that a man must be acceptable to every woman he may happen to like himself." And so, like, what Fanny is saying here, she never gives a reason to Sir Thomas Bertram, to Edmund. She doesn't give a reason to anyone why she's rejecting Henry Crawford. I mean, the real reason is that she's in love with Edmund, right? But she doesn't want anyone to know that, so she just doesn't give a reason for why she's rejecting him. But she still affirms that she doesn't have to give a reason. Like, the very fact that she does not want to marry him is enough. It doesn't matter if this guy is perfect. It doesn't matter if he's rich. It doesn't matter that she has no other prospects. She doesn't want to marry him, and that's the only reason she needs. I think it's just a much more complex handling of the topic than is done in either Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. It's giving Fanny a lot more agency and making her rejection a lot more powerful. And it's also, yeah, I mean, that's what it's doing. It's making her rejection a lot more powerful because it's so tempting and because she really doesn't have a reason that she gives anyone. Another thing that's really interesting in Mansfield Park compared to Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility is the way that Austen handles class. I think, so like I said, those are the only Austen novels I've read, but I'm pretty sure that Mansfield Park is the only Jane Austen novel that really looks at like I don't want to call the Price family working class because I don't think they would be considered working class. They have two servants and they're not poor. I think they're like a lower professional class. Like her father he's in the Navy. He's just a very low rank in the Navy. They don't have much money. They definitely don't have like an inheritance that they're going to be giving her. You get a glimpse into the Price family. Like part of the novel is set in Portsmouth at the Price family's house. And so you get a glimpse of their life. You also get the Crawfords are like an upper middle class family. And then the Bertrams are this lower aristocratic family. So you get to see in this novel like three different striations of class hierarchy in Britain at the time, which is really interesting. Another theme that I thought was really interesting in this that I didn't see so much in Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility is this idea of having an inner life and an outer life that you express to people. There's a scene where Edmund is talking to Fanny, and he's talking to her about Mary Crawford, and he says, "I know her disposition to be as sweet and faultless as your, Fanny's, own. But the influence of her former companions makes her seem, gives to her conversation, to her professed opinions, sometimes a tinge of wrong. She does not think evil, but she speaks it in playfulness. And though I know it to be playfulness, it grieves my soul." And so there's this idea, right, that Mary, like on the inside, Mary is a really nice she's a nice person. She's a good person inside, is what Edmund is saying. But she says these things that are bad. She speaks very bad things sometimes. It's this idea that you can't really know what's going on inside of someone. And so that's Edmund is speaking about this about Mary to Fanny, but really it applies to Fanny more than any other character. Fanny is a very, very reserved, very passive character, but she has this very rich interior life. Like most of the novel is Fanny observing and thinking about things and feeling things. And she never discusses her feelings. Occasionally her feelings are like gets so overwhelmed that she'll have an outburst. Like at one point, Mary Crawford is making like a comment about how brothers never write their sisters, and Fanny is like so kind of offended by this because her brother William is so good and he writes her all the time and they write each other, and so she has to speak up and be like, that's not true, my brother writes me. But that's one of like a handful of times throughout the novel where the other characters are having a conversation and Fanny will speak up. But Fanny is always paying attention to these conversations and she's thinking about them. We hear her feelings about them through this novel, through her interiority, but she very rarely speaks. And so Fanny isn't speaking evil when she speaks it. In fact, Fanny is only ever speaks goodness. But Fanny does feel evil sometimes, which is an interesting thing to me. Like she feels jealousy very frequently, but she never comments upon it. And so there's a discrepancy between what characters feel on the inside and what they present to the outside world. One of the other major themes in Mansfield Park that isn't in Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility so much is this sense of morality that Fanny espouses, especially, that's about like her morality is very like chaste and passive and calm, quiet, reserved. She's basically the opposite of the Crawfords. And so it's kind of set up like Fanny is this like moral paragon, and we have her in opposition to the Crawfords over here and the Bertram sisters, who all kind of like they have looser morals, I guess is the way you would describe it. Like they're more flirtatious. They're not as careful about the way that they express themselves, that kind of thing. And in a way, Fanny is kind of set up as like Fanny is sort of healing the moral deficiencies of the Bertram family. Like you have Sir Thomas Bertram is a slave owner. The Bertram sisters both have like moral sexual failings, and Fanny is basically perfect, right? And she marries Edmund and everything is good again. But like, is it actually? It's kind of, so one of the things that I like about this is that it's very open-ended how we're supposed to read Fanny's morality. Like, is Fanny actually moral? Does she actually heal the Bertram family? The closing paragraph of the novel starts with the sentence, "With so much true merit and true love, and no want of fortune or friends, the happiness of the married cousins must appear as secure as earthly happiness can be." And so are you supposed to read that as like they lived happily ever after? Or are you supposed to read this with like some Austen irony to it? And like maybe they're not as happy as they could ever be. Maybe they speak that they're happy, but it's really interesting. So there seems to be no attraction between Edmund and Fanny. Like Fanny likes Edmund because he's kind to her and because he shares her morality. And part of her morality is like a chasteness. And so you kind of wonder, like, maybe they have sex like once a year to have a kid or something, and that's their whole relationship. It doesn't seem to have a lot of passion behind it. And it's interesting, like the marriage is sort of glossed over. We don't get the marriage in the book, really. We get this sort of like epilogue chapter that says that they get married eventually. We don't even really get a romance between them. We just get the end of the romance between Edmund and Mary. And then the other thing too is that at the end, Edmund and Fanny take over the parsonage at Mansfield Park because Edmund is a vicar now. So they take over the parsonage at Mansfield Park, and like they're living now. They're repeating what they're living where Henry and Mary used to live now, and so I don't know. I feel like it's kind of implied that like things aren't going to be healed. Like they're going to have children, and these children are going to do the same kinds of things that Maria and Julia did. Like this is just how things are. It's not something that's going to be cured by speaking good things only and never saying bad things. Which kind of gets so that actually kind of touches on another thing that I noticed in this novel that I thought is really interesting, which is there's lots of doubling. So like you get this doubling between Portsmouth and Mansfield, right? There are these two spaces in the novel that kind of mirror each other. And they're different, but in many ways they're also the same. And you get like Henry and Mary are an interesting pair as well, where in many ways they're different, in many ways they're exactly the same. Even you could say Mary and Fanny are doubles of each other in a way. Like in some ways they're really similar, in other ways they're really different. I think that they're kind of opposites in that Fanny keeps everything inside, doesn't speak. Mary speaks everything, probably doesn't keep much all that much inside of herself. Like most things I feel like she's just expressing. Well, she may not express herself like earnestly. She approaches things very obliquely, but she's definitely trying to get the things that she wants. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the characters in the novel. So one of the characters, Mrs. Norris, is like maybe the greatest villain that I've ever read. She's so wicked and awful to Fanny, so abusive. Like every single chance that she gets to tear down this child, she does. Like Fanny is 10 years old when she moves into Mansfield Park, and Mrs. Norris is just like taking her down a peg every chance that she can get. And it's like she comes off as especially evil because it's so believable. Like you can totally imagine this character being a real person. And so it comes off as so much worse because of that. And the Crawfords are also really, really interesting characters, I think. Mary especially, like, it's very difficult to tell for me how much she actually cares for Fanny. I think that she does care for Fanny, and I think that she does truly think of Fanny as a friend. I also think she is trying to manipulate Fanny into marrying her brother, because I think she desires that because she loves her brother, but also because she likes Fanny too. Yeah, it's hard for me to tell like how malicious is Mary being. And it's kind of, Henry, I think, is a really interesting character in a similar way. Like, I think Henry really does love Fanny. And it's hard for me to tell. I think Austen kind of leaves it up in the air. Like, did Fanny really change Henry? Was Henry a better person? And maybe Henry, like, maybe Fanny's rejection of Henry is what made him revert to his old ways. Maybe if Fanny had married Henry, he'd be a good person still. It's I think I like that they're complex characters. Like, you can read them many ways. And of course, like, I think that's not to say that Fanny is at fault for the things that Henry does, but I think you can read it that way. So anyway, my concluding thoughts. I think that Mansfield Park is a really complex novel, maybe the most complex of her first three novels. I can also see, so there's a lot of controversy, especially around the character of Fanny Price. So Mansfield Park is probably her most divisive novel, I would say. Like, people online either love it or they hate it. And I can see why. It's definitely, I think, like I said, I think it's the most complex of the first three novels. It's definitely a much slower burn than Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility. And I also think that because it's so complex, like it doesn't tie things up as cleanly as Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice do. It leaves a lot of ambiguity. Like I was saying, I think that you can read it as not having a happy ending. And I think the big thing that people dislike about this book is just the character of Fanny Price. I can see why people dislike Fanny Price. But at the same time, I don't think that you read a book because you necessarily like all of the characters or even the main character. I think Fanny Price is a very interesting character, for sure. And I thought that it was a very, very complex and interesting and pleasurable book to read. So I would highly recommend it. I probably wouldn't recommend it as your first Austen book, just because it is so divisive, And if you hate it, I wouldn't want you to be put off Austen forever, because Austen is like one of the greatest writers in the English language. So yeah, I would probably recommend picking up Pride and Prejudice. Or I like Sense and Sensibility too, but that one also seems kind of divisive for some reason. I think I probably prefer it to Pride and Prejudice, but I think Pride and Prejudice is probably your place to start with Jane Austen if you want to start somewhere. But don't sleep on Mansfield Park. It's very good. Highly recommend it.